Okay, perfect. So I think we can start. We can open to the audience the webinar, and Mr. Graziosi can open the conversation.
Yes, thank you. Can I start or no?
Yes, I think so. Correct?
Roman,
Yes,
can we start?
please start.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar organized by Associazione Guido Carli and Heritage Foundation. I'm Stefano Graziosi. I write for the Italian newspaper La Verità, mainly covering US politics. It's a great honor for me to moderate this discussion between Federico Carli, chairman of Associazione Guido Carli, Alexandra Sova, member of Associazione Guido Carli, and Riccardo Casale, government relations specialist. Our special guests are Dr. James Carafano and Ambassador Giulio Terzi di Sant'Agata. Dr. Carafano is Vice President at Catherine and Shelby Conlon Davis Institute and has the responsibility for Heritage Foundation's defense and foreign policy team. On the other side, Giulio Terzi is a former Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs and is President of the Global Committee for the Rule of Law, Marco Pannella. The title of our meeting is The New Global Order, the World After 2020 Elections. The topic of the US election is deeply important, not only for its consequences on US politics, but also for the world order. This American electoral race is very uncertain, and for this reason, we will try to understand its potential geopolitical impact. President Ronald Reagan once said, "Every time we vote, we help to make America stronger." Is that still the situation today? We will try to answer to this question. So, firstly, I see the floor to Federico Carli in order to introduce this webinar. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graziosi. I warmly thank Mr. Sova, Dr. Carafano, Mr. Casale, and Ambassador Giulio Terzi for attending our webinar. Today, Associazione Guido Carli and Heritage Foundation will continue the cycle of webinars on the new global order who start in July. Today, we will discuss about the next American elections. Indeed, the upcoming elections are crucial at least for three reasons. Number one, the repercussions that they will have on the global challenges that the world is facing: poverty, terrorism and international security, post-COVID-19, climate change, migrations, among others. Number two, the repercussions that they will have on American economy and therefore on the economy of the entire world and on the international geopolitical order. Number three, to understand what is happening within American society and to grasp the general trends that will prevail in the American society over the next years. Outlining the evolutionary picture of the American society means to capture the trends that the most important democracy in the world will follow. On an international level, the vote on November 3rd is more important than ever because it will take place in a turmoil period. Indeed, we are experiencing a phase of rapid change: political, demographic, social, technological, economic changes. In the background are the environmental challenge, climate change, migrations, the global recession that COVID-19 provoked, with the exception of China. Change must therefore be understood and guided rather than passively accepted by the ruling groups of the main nations of the world, generating understandable dissatisfaction to large parts of the world population, at least in the Western Hemisphere. The equilibria and relations between countries will change. Whoever will be the next president of the United States of America, understanding in what direction and with what consequences for the Italian and American people is the goal of today's discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. Graziosi, and I'm sure that we will have a fruitful discussion.
Thanks, Dr. Federico Carli. I will divide the discussion into several sections. Each section will deal with a specific political or geopolitical issue. So let's start with the US elections. My first question is for Ambassador Terzi. Ambassador, national polls show Biden strongly ahead, even if in some battleground states, Trump is behind by a smaller margin than 4 years ago. So, in your opinion, do you believe that the national polls could not reflect reality? And in your opinion, is it still possible a victory for Trump? Please.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me renew to the full audience my sincere appreciation and thanks to your foundation, Guido Carli Foundation, really a star among the Italian think tanks, and to Heritage, represented by Dr. James J. Carafano, Professor Federico Carli, very graciously invited me to this debate. I would make a first point, being an Italian and an European. As an Italian, I try not to venture into the difficult areas of domestic American politics, or to betting on a candidate or another, because I have an enormous admiration and especially a faith in the meaning of the American presidency as an institution which has historically, since the beginning of the United States history, been for Italy, for most of the time, if we take the exception of unfortunate years during World War II, has been always a beacon of freedom, rule of law, human rights promotion, and so on. So I think that whatever is the outcome of this race, very difficult race, not only very difficult, but enormously, perhaps more important. I mean, there have been important race after World War II, World War I, but this one is like a situation where there is a competition between two very prominent candidates. Let me use this term. I don't want to be a partisan, for the reasons that I said. Two prominent candidates who represent different aspects of the American society, of American politics, American economy, and international alignment of the United States. So I believe that is a close call. The race is open, in my opinion. There's nothing new that I'm saying here, but you have, if you look at the poll, as you properly said, dear Stefano, there are 7 states, as you know: Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, which are close in 4 of them, if I'm correct, there is a new situation, 3 or 4 of them, at least a new situation in comparison to the situation which existed in the previous competition between Democrats and Republicans, where President Trump, as a candidate, Trump was already the front runner. Here, the front runner is Joe Biden. But what are the critical points in this race? Not only the number that can be influenced by the reasons why people who are polled express themselves and express his preference, but the reasons are that now, for the first time, I believe, in recent American history, I don't want to enter into the field which is specific to Dr. Carfano and much more learned and experienced than I am. But I believe this is the first time, as far as I remember, that issues like postal vote, early voting, split between Afro-American, Latino, and the other votes are so evident. And the situation is, I'm not putting the onus of the responsibility of between the Democrats and the Republicans, who are the most responsible for the radicalization of the political debate in this America that we are living with. But there is no doubt that whatever is the reason of the last 15 years, maybe 20, I remember the time of the Tea Parties, the situation has radicalized enormously, because there is no doubt there has been a center-right or right, as you would say in Italian terms, that has become much more assertive, and there has been a liberal, maybe even socialist, look Elizabeth Warren and others, on the Democratic side, which have become much more assertive in the extreme, let's say, quote unquote, extreme liberal position. So it is unheard, the kind of debate that we have seen over the last bilateral discussion and a direct confrontation between President Trump and Vice President Joe Biden has been unheard of in the past. Now, with the town hall discussion last night, there has been a different image of the two candidates. And I think there has been a progress for everybody. The fact that they have expressed themselves and they have kept a tune which is considered by the general public and also by European sensitivities more attuned to the institutional role of the people who are at the top of the American power. So I believe that the race is open. It's going to have, as Professor Carli was saying, there's going to be an enormous impact in our in all aspects of the human history, without saying that, without exaggeration. In all these aspects, political, economic, the fight against pandemia, the big new power which is emerging so forcefully, strongly, and in a threatening way, which is China, which is our main problem in the future after the pandemic, which has been created there, by the way. And I believe that this competition open is extremely important. We have only 15 days to go, and there is a lot of anxieties for the policies which will come out of this competition.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thanks so much. Dr. Carafano, I have the same question for you. Do you think Trump can win this difficult election?
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
I repeat. I have to repeat.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me now? Is that
okay? Do you listen to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Carafano, I have yes, the same questions. The same question for you. Do you think that President Trump can win this difficult election, this campaign against Joe Biden?
Right. So I'm definitely the worst person to ask. Can you hear me? Is the audio coming through? No. All right. Let me.
I cannot listen to him. Is there some technical problem? I don't know. Do you listen to me?
Is Dr. Carafano with us, or is trying probably to get in again?
I don't find him. He disappeared. Okay, for now, I have another question for Ambassador Terzi. So, Ambassador, do you listen to me?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thank you. So, turning to China, China is the other topic that we want treated this evening. President Trump has always had a tough, but also I think a pragmatic approach to China. Last January, there had been a sort of detente about trade through the so-called Phase 1 agreement. However, we know relations between the two countries have deteriorated due to the coronavirus crisis. So do you think that in a potential second term, President Trump can change his tough approach to China? And if so, how? Please.
I frankly don't think that maybe the tools that President Trump will engage in a second term vis-à-vis China may be different, may differ, may try to go back to making a focus on his personal excellent relation with President Xi Jinping and to try to obtain concrete results about the balance of the trade balance and intellectual property protection, cyber theft, economic intelligence, Chinese economic intelligence, the civil military fusion, which is really the dogma that China has been following for at least 25, 30 years, but is enhancing so much with President Xi Jinping. Maybe all these areas may be the playing field of some adjustment between a new Trump presidency and the immortal presidency of President Xi Jinping, because we know that the difference between our presidents and the Chinese president is the fact that our president has to be reconfirmed by election. Was mentioned very properly the fact that Ronald Reagan was saying that every election should reinforce our democracy and not destroy it. And I agree that both the candidates in the United States now, they have in their inner feeling this belief, because they are playing along the rules, whatever we can say with some interpretation or another, or the hysteria that sometimes comes out from these debates. But there is no doubt that a second term will be a term of for the United States, for the administration, to reassess its national interest, and to say also the Atlantic interest, the Atlantic interest, the Western democracies' interest in the situation. There have been many talks about the continuity at least for certain aspects of a possible Biden presidency with the turnaround which has been made over the last 4 years by President Trump in the relations with China. And I believe, having been a witness for, fortunately, a short season, but a very dense and interesting season as an ambassador to Washington during the Obama mandate, and also for a short time also Minister of Foreign Affairs under the same presidency, I did note, of course, it would have been a terrible ambassador if I had noted that the music in Washington concerning China was already changing 10 years ago. I'm talking about 10, 12 years ago. From the music which was played by the Clinton administration number 1 and 2 at the time of accession, all the other European government at the time of accession, let's open up to China because because the economic reform, the market reform will induce a new constitution even in China, will induce democracy, respect of the rule of law and so on. That was right. I could use another term. It was a total fake news and fake dreams which were expanded at that time. So I believe that there are the roots also in the democratic environment, not to talk about the economic and financial interest, industrial interest, the employment interest, to keep a sort of navigation similar to the one undertaken by President Trump. But I don't know really if that navigation with a democratic presidency would be clear enough and strong enough and assertive enough to deter the Chinese power and the Chinese might of imperial and communist capability to be dominant in the entire world. I'm not sure that sophisticated dialogues, reason, mechanism would make an impact enough to really put things in place. I'm making just an example. The whole area of ICT, information and communication technology, the whole area is very much covered in terms of standard setting, governance of the International Telecommunication Union and all the other bodies in the UN framework, has been strongly appropriated by Chinese officials of the Chinese Communist Party, which have become UN officials, but who behave exactly as officials of the Chinese Communist Party without caring too much that the Charter of the United Nations would oblige them to represent the international, the global interest, and not their interest only of their own country. But nothing has been really made by the US and the European Union up to a few years ago, until President Trump arrived to the White House, in order to reverse this trend, not to give a free ride to Chinese international officials at the UN to do whatever they want and to care really very little about the interest of the world. Look what is happening at the World Health Organization. The Chinese have completely violated the international health regulation. Nobody is calling their responsibility. Now there is a mission of the World Health Organization, which is already 8 months late, but they cannot enter China in any case, even after all that pandemic. And even if the director of the World Health Organization is one of their men, Dr. Tedros is renowned to be a representative of China, not representative of Ethiopia. So I'm saying all this because the Trump president these 4 years has made not only a huge effort, but in my opinion, has obtained a very significant result in convincing and preparing the ground also for the Europeans, and here I'm speaking like European, of changing their assessment. Why the mood in Berlin, in Paris, not enough in Rome, but in many other European capitals and in Brussels, why the mood vis-à-vis China has changed so much? Because we felt that what was coming, the voice which was coming from the other part of the ocean, was a reasonable voice, that it was also a voice which would protect and which would help Europeans as well. That's why we have to connect, whoever is going to be the next president, but especially with President Trump, with whom the Europeans have had differences. We could talk about Iran, for instance, but also about China. We should reconnect more closely and more efficiently with our American friends as Europeans, and look at China as a basic overarching strategic issue for our future.
Thanks, very clear, Ambassador. Thank you. Can you hear me, Dr. Carafano?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No? Oh, good. All right, so you can hear what I'm saying?
So I have 2 questions now for you. Let's start from China, I think, and maybe better. Dr. Carafano, last summer, US counterintelligence said China would prefer Joe Biden as US president. Do you think Beijing really wants Biden at the White House? And do you think that a potential Biden administration will change the American approach to China? I ask this not only with regard to military sector and artificial intelligence, but also concerning trade, because in the last and only vice presidential debate, Biden's running mate, Kamala Harris, sharply criticized Trump's trade war with China. And Joe Biden, you know, when he was senator, strongly supported the so-called engagement policy toward China. So what's your opinion about that? Please.
Well, let me pick up where the ambassador left off, because I thought his assessment of China and the U.S. position on that was exactly correct. I think this election in some ways is less important for the international community than many might think, looking at the great diversity between the 2 candidates. I think there is more continuity than change coming to U.S. policy. So if you actually look, there's a lot of bipartisanship. What is key to the United States? With global power, with global interests and responsibility. We want a peaceful and prosperous Western Europe. We want a stable, peaceful, prosperous Middle East. We want the Indo-Pacific to be free and open. And that's, I think both parties agree on that. What are the great challenges to that? Again, I think they all agree. Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. I think that's bipartisan. And so I think that both Republicans and Democrats do want the administration to push back and push up on China. Here's, I think, is the big difference between all of those. Look, Russia is under straits. Iran is near bankrupt and under pressure. North Korea has been the quietest it has ever been. China has a lot of cards to play. So I'm not sure that the difference in future U.S. policy is going to be about whether it's a Biden administration or the second Trump administration, but about how China chooses to play the cards that it has. Because unlike those others, China has a lot of cards to play. And we've seen them in the last 2 years as the international community, I think in part led by the United States, has pushed back against malicious and destabilizing Chinese behavior. The Chinese have been very adaptive, everything from kind of wolf warrior diplomacy to pressuring people to trying to accommodate countries, bribe countries, undermine countries, so that they've tried to find ways to push back on the counter pressure against them. So part of the question will be, after the election, how do the Chinese choose to go forward? And I think in part, not just the United States, but our allies will have to adjust to that. But I just want to make one very important point, which I think is really fundamental, which is, as the ambassador mentioned, many differences in the candidates, differences between European and American perspectives. But fundamentally, we all agree that human rights, freely elected governments, and free market economic systems are good. We do. China doesn't believe that. And fundamentally, the Chinese Communist Party sees those three things as an obstacle to the expansion of its power and influence. And so the reality is, regardless of who the American president is and who the European leaders are and the American leaders are, if we do not band together, this isn't about China, but if we do not band together to protect the equities of human rights, free enterprise, and freely elected governments, they will be greatly under threat.
Thanks so much, Dr. Carafano. I have also another question concerning U.S. elections. So, do you think that President Trump can win this difficult campaign against Joe Biden?
I think the ambassador summed it up very well. Nobody really knows how the American election is going to come out. There are some great variables that we've never dealt with before. We have a significant number of what's called first-time voters, people who have not voted in the past. We don't really know how to poll those as likely voters. And many of those voters are in the swing states that the ambassador mentioned. We don't know how COVID is going to impact people wanting to go to the polls. We don't know how efficient the states are going to be in addressing an unprecedented number of mail-in and absentee ballots. So I don't think anybody on either side that is a real serious political analyst thinks that they are confident that you could just look at the polls or the other anecdotal data and feel really confident how this would come out. For those of you who aren't really familiar with the American system, as you know, we just don't have a popular vote. We vote essentially by state. The candidate who wins the most votes in that state, they get what's called the electoral votes. So we can have a situation where you could win the electoral college and actually have less of a popular vote. You could win both. And so in terms of the election, what really matters is the electoral vote. And because of the criticality of these swing states, you could have a situation where one candidate could sweep the field and have an enormous electoral advantage, or we can have a very small number of votes go the other way and it could be very tight, or we can have a very small vote that go the other way and another candidate could sweep the field in the electoral advantage. And since in all likelihood, states will be counting ballots after Election Day, depending upon how the tallies look on Election Day, we might know on Election Day who the president is. We might not know to several days after. And because some of the states might be close, there could be judicial challenges, which may delay the outcome for several weeks. But whoever came up with the system was really smart, because the election is in November, but the actual transfer of power is in January. And so there's plenty of time to work this out. And indeed, we have a number of elections in our history where we've had to do that. And people probably remember Gore v. Bush, where it took several weeks and the Supreme Court had a rule on the final voting count in Florida. But in 1800, we had an election that ended in an absolute tie, and it went to the House of Representatives to determine who the president was going to be. And it took them 36 ballots to elect Thomas Jefferson. But to the ambassador's point, I would be cautious about looking at all the electoral politics and everything and saying this says something largely about the state of American democracy and the state of our civil society. 1800 was actually maybe the most controversial election we've ever had in our history. And 4 years later, Jefferson was elected in a landslide, and it was, you know, people were pretty sanguine about the whole thing. So we have had many periods in our history, 1968 and others, where we've had very tough domestic politics, and they have been followed by periods of relative political anonymity, and a lot of that has to do with the state of the economy and many other issues. So I actually think if you look at the state of American democracy and political solidarity today, America is actually more coherent than it was, say, at the height of the disturbances in the 1960s with the anti-war debates of the civil rights demonstration. So I actually think the democracy is pretty solid. It will make for really good news. But, you know, I would go back to my original point. I really do believe on foreign policy, my expectation is because, you know, geopolitics are the same, America's interests are the same, there's going to be a lot more continuity than change in American foreign policy after the election.
Thanks so much, Dr. Carafano. Turning to Europe and Middle East, Ambassador Terzi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Yes, perfect.
Do you think that potential Biden administration can change President Trump's policy concerning Iran? And what kind of impact could that have on the relation between the US and Europe? Please.
Well, if you look at the expectation of the Iranian regime, the Ayatollahs, the theocracy, the Iranian theocratic dictatorship, if you look at what they are waiting and praying for, is a change of presidency. It is a change of presidency because, not only because the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement in 2015 was signed by nuclear agreement. It's not a nuclear agreement. We know it's not ratified and so on. It's more a program than an agreement. But it was really strongly pushed by President Obama, and his group. I mean, it was not a personal reason why he was a true believer on the fact that the Iranians, in a way, there are similarities with this idea of dialogue in diplomacy and stretching the first hand to an opponent or to an old enemy to try to reconvert him to the improvement of his society and the responsibility in the international community. We have been making in modern history the same appeasement mistake, the terrible appeasement mistake. We know very well the Munich Conference, but we have never recovered from that. We are falling in the trap. We are falling in the trap, falling in the trap all the time. And so Obama presidency was strongly committed to stop the Iranian proliferation, nuclear weapons in Iran, and to engage seriously the Iranian regime. That did not work for at least two major reasons. First reason was that Iran, after 2003 and the end of Saddam Hussein government, became they had already, since the Khomeini revolution, this messianic vision that they were the leaders of the Ummah, of the Islamic world, although they were representing just a minority, 10 or 15% of the overall, the global Islam. But they already at that time, at the time of Khomeini, they were convinced that there would have been a time for them to lead the Islamic world and to make a big advancement. But when they found themselves after a very bloody war confrontation with Saddam Iraq's and the war which lasted many years, as we know, and they were given a big gift of a district practically after the international coalition intervened to remove Saddam, and that was the mistake, which was admitted also by President Bush and Condoleezza Rice openly, to follow a strategy which didn't keep any basic element of the Iranian state in place, starting with the armed forces, with all the officers around Saddam, which could have been reconverted in interlocutors for the future of the country. Iran became really the dominant player in Iraq through the Shia population, which is probably the majority of the Iraqi population. And therefore, to deal with this empowered Iran, power in Iran of the last 20 years, much stronger, much influential, and one of the major suppliers of oil and gas to the world, huge wealth for them, although misappropriated by the mullahs, who are the most corrupted, among the most corrupted leaders in the world. So Iran became really a very assertive and dominant element in Middle East, with that obsession, which was partly propaganda, but also a real program for them to destroy Israel, to get rid of Israel, and to show through the destruction of Israel that they were the only one who were eliminated. They had to use Nazi terms, but these are also Nazi policies, the policies that the Iranians are carrying on, to use Nazi terms, the final solution to the Jewish problem. So what the dialogue in the original sense, appeasement, is not working. Appeasement is only encouraging the Iranian leadership. And quite frankly, the Iranian agreement has always been a sort of a joke. It is, I have dealt with, I'm an old chap, I'm dealt with for decades with non-proliferation, negotiation, agreements, international security. And this is the first time that I see in an agreement of non-proliferation a total lack of focus on verification. President Reagan was saying a number of times, yes, trust, but verify. With Iran, we trust through that agreement. We trust and we don't verify, only because the verification takes 3 weeks at least of advance notice to visit, and you cannot visit any military site. So there are many reasons. So incredibly, the situation is very clear in the Trump administration and is absolutely consistent with what President Trump as a candidate was saying since 2016, 2015, was very much clear in his agenda. Nobody believed it in Europe. Nobody thought that that would have been a successful story. I consider that the Iranian posture of the Trump administration has been one of the most success stories of this president, because what is generating around is generating a completely new environment. You see that there is a new movement, a new evolution among Arab countries to reconvert all the strategic balance, not only in the Gulf, but in the Mediterranean, in the allegiances and the alliances which are taking place to go through the Libyan crisis, and even to a certain extent also the Syrian crisis, and first and foremost, the security and the understanding, the opportunities that the new relations between United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, but in the making, Saudi Arabia and Egypt already, but possibly even Sudan. I mean, Sudan was the cradle of Al-Qaeda. The founder of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, was there until 1996. And even Sudan, with all the eternal difficulties with radical Islam among a large part of the population, is considering to open up in the same form. That what does it mean at the end? That means that not only the countries that I mentioned in the Arab world now are committed to peace, to create a framework of peace and security in the Middle East, especially in the most critical point of the Middle East, which is the oil-producing country of the Gulf, but is also committed to new contacts, people-to-people contacts, free travels among them, now opening up the flights, connections, communication, and education and science. This is the big stuff, and this is the big. And the time is over, in my opinion, for Europeans to understand fully the perspective which we are facing is a positive perspective. We have to stop to go to our old mantras that, yes, it is true, this is going to benefit the Palestinians, but it is not realistic to continue this story that a formal peace treaty or two-state solution with the Palestinians must happen before anything else moves in the Middle East, because doing that, we have encouraged the birth of the Islamic State, thousands of terrorist factions, and we have imbalanced a whole region. So even on it, it's better for the Europeans stick together with the Americans and hope the Americans will cooperate and work together with Europeans on these issues.
Thanks, Ambassador. Thanks so much. So for my last question, I would like to deal with Russia. Dr. Carafano, in July, Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that Russia is a bigger election threat than China. And on the other hand, Joe Biden has always said very negative words for Russian President Vladimir Putin. So, in your opinion, what kind of policy could President Biden adopt toward Russia?
Well, I think our policies are.
Please. Take your time.
I think, look, I think our policies are going to be very similar regardless of the outcome of the election. I think the Americans, in a bipartisan way, look at Russia as the chief threat to European peace and stability. From a military standpoint, energy, political disinformation, and I think this administration has had the toughest policy on Russia that we've had in a decade. I don't see any appetite among Republicans or Democrats to really change that. Every president, including this president, comes into office with this desire to reset relations with the Russians. There's a very low expectation among either Republicans or Democrats that that's possible. So the last thing I would expect is a Biden administration say, well, let's just clean the state and start over. I don't think anybody thinks that's going to work. Really, to have a different relationship with Russia, we need a different Russian leader. And we don't have one. And we're unlikely to get one anytime soon. If you listen, so I don't see the policy change. And if you listen a lot to the Biden administration, mostly what they talk about is we'll have a different tone. We'll talk about things differently. We'll work with allies. And, you know, that sounds very, I think, probably very pleasant to the European ear from a superficial perspective. But I think the real question is does that really matter? Because the fundamental issues don't change, and they can't be solved by tone. The reality is particularly on Russia, this administration has worked with allies. NATO conventional deterrence has improved and is on a trajectory to improve for 4 years. That's bad for Russia. This administration has worked with Europeans on Ukraine and been very supportive of Ukraine, and that, as close as we come to a frozen conflict, Americans and Europeans are largely on the same trajectory when it comes to dealing with Belarus. The U.S. opposition to Nord Stream 2 is a position that's shared by many Europeans because they see Nord Stream 2 as a challenge to European energy markets and to energy security. So it would be very, very difficult in a second Trump administration or in an administration run by President Biden to really walk away from these policies which really have diminished Russia's threat to the West. So I actually, again, this is an area where I am looking for more continuity than radical fiscal change.
Thanks, Dr. Carafano. So now I cede the floor to Federico Carli, Alexandra Arsova, and Riccardo Casale for their questions. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graziosi. I have just a quick question, both to Ambassador Terzi and Dr. Carafano. In Italy, the common view on Brexit is that the European Union will take advantage and will be benefit by UK leaving her. My view is quite the opposite, personally, since I believe that EU has much to lose by UK leaving her. Now, my question is, will a Trump presidency vis-a-vis a Biden presidency make any difference on the UK foreign policy? How will the US-UK relations change in the case of a Trump or Biden presidency? And consequently, how will the UK-EU relations change in the two scenarios? And then I'm also curious to know whether Ambassador Terzi believes that European Union will take advantage by UK leaving her or not.
Thank you very much, Professor Carli. Well, I'm not a Brexiter. I'm not a fanatic supporter of Europe as it has been over the last 10 years, especially after the financial crisis. I mean, the lack of solidarity, cooperation, migrations, you mentioned very much, very well in your introduction, Professor, the fact that these are going to be climate change, migration, economic cycles, and health problem, pandemia, which is not going to be the last chapter of the pandemic diseases in the world, COVID-19. So, but we Europeans had made many mistakes, not all of them, but the mistake was from the states who were not showing a direct solidarity not to be more forthcoming on many issues, and they showed that also especially during financial crisis, but also the mistakes were made by countries like Italy, I have to admit, some other Mediterranean partners, which have not been serious enough of cleaning up their house in financial terms, in terms of corruption, in terms of rule of law, in terms of international credibility for what they are doing and the commitment they are taking. So let's not put the blame of anybody. Everyone has to do his little homework. But I believe that the Brexit was an unfortunate turn of history, which could have been avoided. Would have been avoided, first of all, not calling the referendum, but also dealing with the referendum. It's a big question mark. We were talking about Russia before. I have little doubts that Russian actors I wouldn't say the Kremlin more than the secret police or individual group organization, hackers, economic interest, let's say corruption and so on, is not the final responsible in meddling in European elections. I'm not opening the Pandora box of the discussion about famous discussion, which partisan, not bipartisan discussion in the United States about meddling or not, if they did so in 2016 and if they are doing that also now as the FBI is denouncing. But it was quite visible that there was there were Russian operations in influencing the electorate through social media, planned Russia Today, Sputnik, publication, and so on, doing propaganda in favor of Brexit against the European Union, trying to destabilize. Unfortunately, I have great respect for President Putin. He's a great partner of my country. I've always believed that the security in Europe can work only if there is a cooperation, a cooperative security framework, including Russia. But I have also to take, it is for me, from what I've studied and seen and studied especially, it is quite evident that there is a Russian interest in splitting the Europeans. The more, and this is an incident which coincides with the interest of China. The more separate, divide et impera. It is a motto which is valid not only in Roman times, but today's, especially today's. So Brexit, I fully concur with your view, Professor, that Brexit has been, we cannot see as a positive thing, but still we can hope that it's not going to be a hard Brexit, that there is be a trade agreement, at least an economic agreement for keeping united the market and open the market between Britain and the European Union as much as it can, even in the services sector. But there is no doubt that there is an area that we have to fight for keeping it together and unified in a way. That is the area of security and defense. I do not think that we can diminish the intensity of our cooperation in defense and security with Britain. And fortunately, we have a common platform, which is NATO. Very glad that Dr. Carafano mentioned NATO, because there have been a number of misunderstandings and misperceptions about Trump presidency on NATO. My interpretation is that it was mainly a financial issue, but the commitment of the Trump administration to NATO has been there, strong and solid, and that was shown also, in particular, during the last November London summit, which for the first time for NATO emphasized the threats and the problems that can drive to NATO security, NATO alliance from China. And I believe that also NATO should be in the picture when we are talking for China, because we have enormous resources, political opportunities, and also cooperation in security and defense in areas which are connected to countering the Chinese threat. So again, Brexit, the UK must be as close to the Europeans as it was before Brexit. In trade is an open question mark, is a really question mark whether Brexit is going to have a dramatically positive impact in the exchanges between the UK and the US, because the problems are bigger than the opportunities which were offered to the British public during the Brexit campaign, in my belief.
Well, I really appreciated the Professor's question, because I think it gets to the core of the issue. It doesn't matter at this point if you think Brexit was a good idea or a bad idea, it's a reality. And how is that going to impact us going forward? You know, I will say on foreign policy, I think the area where we'll see the most immediate impact is I really expect the British to move more towards the American position on Iran. And I think that's very, very healthy. I think the ambassador outlined very well the deep flaws of the Iran deal. And it's not practical. Even if there is a Biden administration to go back to the deal. The deal is essentially dead. We need a more common approach on dealing with Iran. And I think that the UK will actually be a leader in helping driving that. And there, I think there is a bright shining there. I actually think it's, I know people always say, well, we'll miss the British voice in the European Union. But I think the reality is the British voice outside the European Union, an independent European voice on economic and military and political issues is going to be healthy. And I think it'll actually be healthy to help the Europeans see a diversity of views. And so I'm in the optimistic course in terms of dealing with some of these really, really big issues. And I think it also gets to the point as I think the Trump administration is wrongly labeled as being anti-European Union. And I really don't think that's true. The president was pro-Brexit, and that is fundamentally because the president believes in the sovereignty of the individual state, and if the British people decided to go in that direction, the president supports that. That doesn't necessarily translate to the United States is against the European Union. I actually think there are many areas in which this administration has been very constructive and helpful for the European Union. And there's an enormous amount of areas where we would want more cooperation, again, regardless of if it's Trump or Biden, particularly a number of policy issues. Libya's one, Belarus, Ukraine, Western Balkans. These are all areas where there's a lot of work to be done together. The United States has been a tremendous supporter of the 3 Cs initiative. That is something I think the European Union is also deeply interested in. This is an important economic, I think, infrastructure project for developing the countries in Central and Southern Europe. That's an area we work together. The United States has been a supporter of what's called the Clean Network, this notion of standards, international technology standards to ensure that countries such as China cannot introduce malicious capabilities and influences in our digital infrastructure. I think that's an important initiative when we compare together. The United States has been supporting something called the Blue Dot Network, which is standards on FBI investments and infrastructure. Again, something with the European Union. So I think there's an enormous space for that in cooperation. And the fact that the UK is outside of the European Union family doesn't mean that I think that the partnership, the transatlantic partnership between the US, the UK, and the EU can't be enormously productive. And that the UK can't serve the role that it's always served, is that really the bridge between the two sides of the transatlantic community. So I know there are many European voices that are not happy with Brexit, but I'm in the optimistic camp that in the end, this will actually, there are a lot of positives that we can extract from the reality that we have.
Okay, this is Alexandra speaking. Hi to both of you. I have a question. I'm going back to US elections. So I have a question about the role of social medias. And so, of course, over the last year, social media have become very important in elections, and even more so now that public events are limited and everything is carried on via the social media or television, or also traditional media. Considering also some events or the past days when some social media eliminated certain articles and posts for different politicians. So to what extent social media, according to you, will influence the vote? And then another connected question regarding the communication styles between President Trump and Biden. Back in 2016, President Trump election an important contribution to his election was his disruptive communication style. So very straightforward, very bold, very assertive. So do you think that this style is an advantage in these elections, or it has become a disadvantage? So thank you.
Yeah, can I just address that real quickly? I actually think it's the reverse. It's not how social media is affecting the electorate. What we're actually seeing is the electorate changing their views on social media based on their political alignment. So there's the role of Facebook, Twitter, Google. This is actually becoming quite controversial in the United States. And it's a reflection of the politics looking at them, not them driving the politics. So in a sense, over the last year, the shoe's gotten on the other foot. And so the real question will be is, after the election, how does the attitude of Americans during the election impact on how we legislate and manage the relationship between government and big technology in the United States? It's something really to keep an eye on, because I think it is incredibly dynamic. Whether the president's communication style is effective or not, I think we're all going to wait for the outcome of the election to answer yes or no. I will say this, right? I don't think it's a repeatable phenomenon. I don't think there's a political class or party in this country that can essentially do what the president did and how he communicates. And so, and we actually have seen, not to get too much into the weeds, but we saw, for example, when in March, when COVID was raging and the president's political fortunes really looked rather bleak, people were already kind of jockeying to be the next Donald Trump, Now, a lot of that's dropped off now because the president's come back in the polls and the economy's picked up and the races are competitive. But there will be people that will try to kind of copy the Trump formula. But to be honest, it's so unique to him. And neither political party or anybody else is really structured to exploit that. I'm not sure it's this is the way people will get to political power in the United States after Donald Trump. I think it's a one-off.
Thank you.
If I may give just a couple of thoughts. Thank you so much. Well, the influence, I agree with Dr. Carfano, and it is true that the political debate develops on social media platform, and therefore it starts with the position of the main players in the political arena, and that is the way they have changed their language. There's no doubt that the discussion, the political discussion, the narrative have changed over the last 10, 15 years since the social media have become such a dominant presence in our daily life. But talking about very pragmatic assessment on what has been happening in Italy, for instance, there are, in my opinion, two political forces, especially one at the beginning, 10, 15 years ago. The Five-Star Movement did bet on social media, social platform, not only to organize the movement and to pass the messages to his base, but also in order to move the campaigns almost entirely. Yes, they have one or two major media publications and so on, but they are extremely efficient in using Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube to increase their influence on the electorate, on the public opinion. And over the last couple of elections, especially the last political elections in 2018, there was a big progress by the League of Salvini, because also the League became particularly effective in using the tool of social media. What is the problem? Is there an effect that the social media by themselves are relaunching in the political environment, which may be unexpected also by the political leaders? In my opinion, yes. There is an autonomous force of the social media, which acts not as a pure recipient on the inputs which are derived from the political players, but it generates inside the social media debate and the expansion. And there is a basic reality that the way Facebook, Twitter, Instagram work, they work on quantity, not on quality. They make money. The more they expand their membership, the more money they make. That there is evidence. The question, if an influencer on YouTube has 4 million followers, makes a certain amount of million in publicity advertising. If it has 400 million followers, is another story. It's a complete. So it's economic question most of all. But how the algorithms are engineered? They are engineered in the way they bring to the extreme position the political debate. Now, there is a big fuss about QAnon. QAnon was a question in the presidential debate, also the last town hall, and there are a lot of stories on QAnon. I'm mentioning QAnon because the let's say the stories that develop on QAnon are becoming relevant also for the European politics. There is a big group which is expanding in Germany, for instance. And believe it or not, in QAnon, it's not the question of extreme right wing, extreme left wing, but it's a question of also infiltration of Chinese and others' agenda that make an instrumental use of QAnon to try to have an impact from their theory against the political establishment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Riccardo, please go on.
Yes, Dr. Carafano, this question is for you. Something that is always asked on this side of the pond in Europe is which candidate has a friendlier immigration policy. Now, while immigration policy was the foundation of Trump's 2016 campaign, it has not received much light in this one. So what would you say are the key differences in how President Trump and how Vice President Biden plan on handling immigration, specifically during this pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the reason why there's not a lot of discussion on immigration in this campaign is across the board on issues from border security to dealing with illegal immigration to legal immigration reforms. The candidates are completely polar opposites. I mean, literally, they believe the opposite of what the other person believes. There's almost no space where the two candidates agree on anything on the whole spectrum of immigration and border issues. So you would say, well, why aren't they talking about it every day? And the answer for that is because there's no votes to get. The people that are for President Trump, they agree with him. The people that are for President Biden, they agree with them. So there's nobody to convince that you're right, because everybody already agrees that they're right. And the small number of independent voters in the middle, immigration is not moving there. So that's one end of discovery. The other issue why I think the other side doesn't want to talk about it is, if you would like or dislike the president's agenda, he has largely succeeded in every single thing he said he was going to do. Cooperation with Latin America on migration issues has never been better. It's incredibly healthy and productive. And that extends to dealing now with transnational crime and other issues. So actually cross-border cooperation with Mexico, Central America, this is the best it's been in a decade. The border wall and other things that presidents put, the border's actually completed most of those, and they've actually proven incredibly efficacious. We're actually deporting more illegal aliens than come into the country every day. So it's kind of like if you did talk about the president's agenda, you have to be complaining about how successful it was, and they don't want to talk about anything the president's done successfully. So it's this weird thing like, yes, this is a really key issue that divides Americans, but nobody's talking about it because everybody's already made up their mind.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carafano. I don't know whether, please, Grazioli, go on.
Thanks so much. Thanks to all. Unfortunately, our time is up. I want to thank Associazione Guido Carli, Heritage Foundation, Dr. Federico Carli, Dr. James Carafano, Ambassador Giulio Terzi, Alexander Sova, and Riccardo Casale for this interesting and I think precious discussions. Thanks to all and good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much.